Welcome to the Church Leaders Podcast, where we're helping you lead better every day. And now, here's your host.
Hello, and welcome to the Church Leaders Podcast. I'm your host, Jason Day, and I am so excited to share this week's episode, which features a conversation I recently had with an incredibly godly, generous, and wise man, Eugene Peterson. Now, Eugene likely needs little introduction, as he is one of America's most well-known theologians. He has written dozens of books. He served as professor of spiritual theology at Regent College, and he was the founding pastor of Christ Our King Presbyterian Church in Maryland, where he served for 29 years before retiring. But perhaps Eugene is best known for his most widely read work, The Message, which he wrote to help make the original meaning of the Bible more accessible and understandable to contemporary readers. On this week's episode, Eugene reflects over his decades of ministry and shares how to navigate the tensions of leading a church. He speaks about the importance of finding rest and Sabbath as a pastor and why listening well is one of the greatest skills a ministry leader can possess. We also talk about his most recent book, As Kingfishers Catch Fire, which is a collection of powerful teachings he shared with his congregation across the years in Maryland. I trust you will enjoy as I invite you to listen in to my conversation with Eugene Peterson. First, I just want to say thank you, Eugene, not only for the many contributions you've made to the church and to the lives of countless Christ followers over the decades, but I want to thank you specifically for your newest book, As Kingfishers Catch Fire. As I've been reading through it, I truly believe it is a gift to the church. And in it, you're sharing 49 sermons that you preached over 29 years as you were shepherding your congregation outside of Baltimore. And I just thank you for being a part of the Church Leaders Podcast today and excited to hear from your heart.
Well, thank you. I'm ready.
Awesome. Well, in the preface of this book, you share that 60 years ago, you found yourself somewhat distracted, that there are a great number of things going on in the world and in the culture kind of swirling about you. And you've been assigned by your denomination to plant a church outside of Baltimore, and you felt confident about your mission to lead. But as time went on, you found yourself sort of, as you mentioned, at odds with your advisors. So if you could talk to us a little bit, what were your challenges that you were experiencing between your calling, your mission to lead and to shepherd that church, and the means and the methods that were being passed along to you?
The church was not in good shape. There was a lot of dissension going on and a lot of volunteers trying to start up new things. And advisors were setting up seminars and teaching us, those of us who were new church pastors, teaching us how to do it. And I welcomed the help to begin with, but later on I just realized that they don't have any idea what a church does or what a pastor does. And they were showing us how to was ending up being a consumer church, finding out what people wanted and then dishing it out to them. And so I just kind of got fed up with that. I went to one of these seminars, and the man who was directing it said the most important thing you can do to have a good church is have a big parking lot.
Wow.
So that was the end of it for me, so I just quit. And so I started trying to find out what was going on and taking things out for myself. So that's how I started. And the mega church that was the beginning of the mega church years. And the disappointing thing was that it worked. And except it didn't seem to me to be like a church. I thought pastors were supposed to be pastors, knowing their people, knowing their names, being in their homes and finding out the way they lived and trying to encourage them and show them the way of Jesus. So that's what that was about.
Yeah, it's interesting because you wrote there in the preface that leadership was interpreted almost entirely from business and consumer models. And I know that
Yeah, that's right.
we see that a lot, even today, over the years. You said that the advisors were ensuring the numerical and financial viability of the congregation, but without even a footnote regarding the nurture of souls. I'm sure,
Correct.
yeah, in our audience, pastors and ministry leaders that listen to our podcast, I'm sure that many of them are wrestling with some of those same tensions, right, between what does it mean to be a pastor, as you said, where you know the people's names and you're concerned about their souls, and then a lot of what we hear about what leadership looks like. What would you say to those pastors who are wrestling with that same tension when it comes to leadership in the church?
I get to know them first, and try just to learn what they think being a pastor is. And most of the time, when in those early years, I realized that they had no idea what a pastor did. They just wanted to be in on something exciting, and it satisfied their desire for being important and for being effective. And but the people that they were doing this with, they didn't even know their names. So that's what I was dealing with.
Now, you say in your book, you say that there were three things that kind of all happened about the same time to you, which had an everlasting impact on your life as a pastor. One was kind of a time of self-awareness. One was a lecture, and one was a poem. Can you unpack these three different things that happened in your life and kind of share with us how they came together and what came out of this?
Well, I think the self-awareness was that I was not preaching. I realized that after 3 or 4 months, I was copying things that I heard on the radio or television or something, and I realized that I was not paying much attention to what the Bible said or what Jesus said, but what elicited some kind of interest or just entertainment from a congregation. So that was kind of self-awareness, just realizing I was being caught up in the world's idea of what it means to be successful and happy and productive. And the lecture was at Johns Hopkins University. I can't think of the name of the guy right now. He was from Switzerland, and he was a doctor, but he had given up his practice as a doctor and just started inviting people. Got rid of his stethoscope and would just invite people who were looking for help and the way they lived, and just listening to them. And I realized that he had given up a lucrative practice for something that meant something to both him and the people he was talking to. And that just cut my fascination with trying to be a consumer pastor.
Right.
And so my wife was with me, and as we were driving home, I said, didn't he speak just really good speech? And he was just fascinating. And she said, well, he was speaking in French. And she said, and Eugene, you don't even know 3 words in French. But he had an interpreter with him, and she was kind of stood in the background just to 4 or 5 feet away from him and was very unobtrusive. But she interpreted everything he said into English. And I realized that something was more human. I mean, he was both the interpreter and his own voice went together. And he wasn't doing this all by himself. And so that was something that started to saturate me with a sense of what I wanted to do. Not find quick ways to give somebody some drugs or antibiotics, but to find out what they were like first and take his time doing it. And that I was not doing that at all. I was developing this new congregation. So that was it. And well, the poem was Gerard Manley Hopkins' As Kingfishers Catch Fire. And Hopkins had been a favorite poet of mine for years and years. And I often memorized his poems because they were so full of metaphor and color and rhythm. And so then that poem, As Kingfishers Catch Fire, As Dragonflies Draw Flame, became kind of a text for me as I was preaching, just to make sure I had the right metaphors and the right rhythms. And so between the physician who would come and spoke to me in French and Gerard Manley Hopkins, he was a priest in England, they became kind of like school for learning how to preach. So I think that I was rescued from the consumer mentality by the beauty of that poetry, by the honesty of the doctor.
Well, that's powerful, because as you listen to that and as you think through that, it's kind of one of the most unlikely places that you'd think that something would come through in that way. And as I have sensed across the years of your ministry and through your writings, that oftentimes it is those unlikely places that the voice of God breaks into our lives. It's not always, like you said, the seminars on how to do this and how to do that, but it's those smaller, more unlikely instances of life where the Spirit just speaks and helps us take those steps into becoming the men and women that God created us to become.
Exactly.
Eugene, as I was reading your book, I was struck by how timely the sermons you were preaching at your church years ago in Maryland really address issues we are facing today. For example, in your message out of Job, you share that the easy answers of Job's friends are a cruel substitute for God himself. We live in an age abounding with such answers. Sometimes we talk them, sometimes we record them. Putting faith in education, technology, counsel, moral programs, and spiritual techniques. And then you go on to explain the solution for Job was not found in all these other things that we so often run to, right? But it was found in God and in listening to God's questions. Can you share with us why listening to God's questions is so important as we journey with him?
People want answers from God. And they keep, the pastors hear this all the time. Why doesn't God answer my prayers? Why doesn't he do this and that? But what we want from God is something to do, something to make me better, something to give me the answers to life. And what we're really after is to answer God ourselves. He's not there to give us answers. Those 49 sermons I preached for my congregation, I really just picked those up. I mean, those sermons are all characteristic of all my preaching. And but I think if you read them closely, you don't find many answers there. You find some openings for listening to God in a way which we would never have anticipated. And so preaching, my understanding of preaching then was developed by reversing what was so common in American Protestantism, of trying to treat God as an answer person. And we don't know enough about God to know what to ask. So we listen, and we listen, and we listen. And sometimes we have people like Job's counselors who insist that he get the answers. But it's not the way it works. So I think, and good preaching is always this way. But there's not very much good preaching these days. A lot of entertainment, a lot of stories. Now, I think a story is important, and I have lots of stories that get into my sermons, but they're not the point of it. The story is to make some identification with the humanity that we carry around with us all the time.
You know, people often will say, well, Jesus is the answer. And I've often said, well, Jesus is really the question. And if you look at Jesus was always helping people come to wrestle with questions about life and about truth and about hope. And I love what you're saying, because I think if we begin to really focus on listening and seeing what those questions are, that helps us to really dig more deeply into the life that God has for us, both as Christ followers on our journey, but then also as ministers and as pastors, as we're seeking to lead our congregations and share the hope of Christ with others. When we can encourage them to wrestle with questions, I see that there's a lot more growth that takes place, as opposed to trying to get a quick answer, which is oftentimes what our culture hungers for, is those quick answers.
Yeah, I agree totally.
Now, as you look back across your decades of ministry, and then you look at the role of the pastor today, and you look at the contemporary church, I'm curious, what advice would you offer to pastors today?
I think I start from the other end. I want to know what they're doing, what they're feeling, what they're missing. And usually what happens is they discover it themselves. I don't think a pastor is in the business of just putting things out there and then expecting people to try it out and figure it out. People are a lot smarter than we think they are. And they notice a lack, they know something's wrong, they know something's missing, but they don't know what it is, but you don't either. And so it's conversation is, I think, one of the most important things that pastors need how to develop. Instead of telling people what to do, asking them what they're doing. I think pastors need to learn how to listen.
Right.
And then fill in the blanks. We don't need more words. We need accurate words. And what's better way to start off than something like the Lord's Prayer? I often, with my parishioners, would invite them to memorize Psalms, and then just when you're driving along or having a meal with somebody, or those Psalms, the Psalms are all prayers, but they don't always look like prayers. And I think if we can saturate our lives with the words of Scripture, but they're not just words, they're prayers, this is these are people's lives getting articulated in ways that they would never guess what they're doing.
So as you're speaking there to pastors and ministers, you're talking about, that conversations are key. Knowing the people that God has entrusted to you is important. And so the skill of listening, as you've shared, and has been really a hallmark of your ministry, that idea of listening is one of those skills that it seems you're saying that pastors should maybe spend more time on learning to listen than on just learning to talk. Would that be fair?
Yeah. Oh, yes. Yeah.
As pastors are, just faithfully serving where God has placed them and kind of walking this journey with their parishioners, would you say that they should encourage one another to speak into each other's lives and to develop this sense of community? And that's where the Holy Spirit is able to work in people's lives, is through that sense of community. Would that be an important piece of this?
Yeah, I think so. Here's a story that I think would illustrate something of what we're doing. There was a young woman in our church who was a school teacher, and she was the teacher of one of my sons. And she had a boyfriend. I'll give him a fictitious name, Michael. And he was the best athlete our little town had ever had. He could do everything: football, baseball, soccer, and he went off to university and he became a drunk. And he was doing drugs a lot, and he was trafficking in drugs, and then he finally got arrested and he was put in jail. And after about 5 years, he was on parole, and he came back to his town, and this young woman who had known him in his pre-jail days, he said he went to his girlfriend at one point and said, I think I'm a Christian, but I have no idea what that means. But there was just, I was in my cell, and all of a sudden there was just this bright light around me, and I couldn't figure out what was going on. And what do you think? Do you think I'm a Christian? And she said, well, I don't know, but I have one of my students her father is a preacher, so let me ask him. So she did, and he told me what had happened. And he said, by the way, there was somebody in my jail cell left a bunch of little papers and about a tithe. What is a tithe? And I said, well, it's money that you give to the church, to Jesus, and it helps other people get healed and food on their tables and things like that. And she said, well, why don't you come and talk to my pastor? So she did. He came and we talked, and I told her what a tithe was. I'd already did that, I guess. And so I said, well, why don't we just have lunch every couple of weeks, and we'll just keep talking about this. And we did, and we just talked about his life and what was going on. And one day he said to me, don't people pray before they eat? And I said, well, yeah, many people do. Well, why aren't we praying? And I said, well, Michael, I know you're new at this whole thing. I just want to embarrass you in public. Well, I'm going to pray. So he prayed, and we were having soup for lunch. And the waitress saw him with his head down over his soup. And she came back. He said, is the soup cold? Is something wrong with the soup? And without opening his eyes, he just turned his face up towards her and said, we're praying. And so that's how he started praying. But it took 4 or 5 months before that happened. And I'm not sure if I'd have started him out with a tithy and a prayer that it would have helped.
Right.
But then he started going to AA, and it wasn't long, and then he was exempted from his weekends in the jail, and within 6 months, he had brought half the county into my church.
Wow.
It was, he was a very gregarious guy. People loved him. He was funny, skilled, but he was under the grip of this of heroin and other thing, or had been. So there was a woman who came to my church during that time, and she told me that she was in AA. I said, well, I think you'd feel perfectly at home here. I mean, I have half a congregation is in AA. And she said, well, I know, I'd noticed that. So it's just, surely he built, he developed a congregation that I could never have done by myself.
Wow.
I think pastors need to be more modest in what they're doing. I had a group of pastors that I gathered in our little town, and we'd meet every Tuesday for lunch, and we'd just bring in sandwiches or whatever, and we'd spend 2 hours together and just talk about what the pastoral life was like and how we could stay on track. There were about 14 of us. And we took scripture lessons and read them and talked about them and tore them apart and whatever. But whenever anybody had some problem, divorce or sickness or runaway kids or whatever, we just drop everything and spend the rest of the time just letting these men and a couple of women, well, they let us be their pastor. Let me put it that way. This went on for 17 years, 18 years. And but these men and one woman, they came up here to where we live now, and for a kind of a weekend of just reviewing what happened. And one of them said, there's a story in Thomas Mann about the woodsman, and sometimes the blade would break off, and sometimes the handle would break off, but it was always the same shovel. And this woman, it was a woman who said, that's what our company of pastors is. It's always the same axe. Sometimes it's the handle, sometimes it's the blade, but it's always the same axe. And I thought that was quite wonderful.
Right.
That we were able to maintain the continuity of what we were doing with each other, without diversion, without trying to get a new axe or something, just keep the same old thing. So anyway, I think pastors, if they knew what it meant, would do a lot better job instead of just trying to raise a crowd of people, or get some special speaker who knows how to tell stories, and then they go off and tell the same stories as somebody else. But I guess becoming a pastor, I realized how difficult it is to be a pastor because it's a lonely business. Except when you have a fellowship of pastors like I had organized, it's not lonely anymore. And we're not trying to impress each other. We're letting each other get into our own skin. And
Yeah, it's a beautiful image to think of. You know, as you were talking there, we see lots of pastors. You know, they fall. They have moral failings, and they get into trouble. They make poor decisions. You know, some very very harmful decisions at times. Do you think that's comes from oftentimes from them isolating themselves rather than having some of the community that you were able to enjoy with your colleagues?
yeah, I think so. The isolation, but I think it's also ambition. Being a pastor for so many people is competitive, and when you're competitive, you're a lot more interested in winning than in helping.
Right. That all seems to come back to a lot of what you talk about is this idea of building relationships, you know, kind of slowing down, building relationships, listening to one another, and being willing to share with one another. And oftentimes it seems like in the world in which we live, you know, things are so fast paced and like you said, there's a lot of that ambition, and it's almost like to slow down and to listen. That's a discipline that you have to be intentional about.
Yeah, it really is. I think sometimes I'm really encouraged. Sometimes I feel like maybe we're taking a turn for the better and are more complete and develop more humility. One of the things I just have such a hard time of comprehending is why a pastor would want to speak to 5,000 people a week and not know anybody's name. And that just seems almost criminal. No matter how well they speak, if you've got 5,000 people listening to you, it's kind of like going to a football game. There's a lot of action that's going on, and a lot of yelling and swearing and everything else. But you leave that football field, and then you go on and do something else. And you shouldn't be doing that if you're a pastor.
Clearly, you're encouraging pastors to have those personal relationships, but we know that oftentimes pastors feel pressure to grow their churches, either from within or outside the church itself. What advice would you give to a pastor who's feeling that type of pressure?
Well, my son is a pastor. He's 55. And he started a church, started a new congregation. And he called up the other day. He said he's really a good pastor. He's a good preacher, knows people. But he called up and said, I spent this week just calling on people cold. I just go up and knock on their door and go in and spend some time with them. And then he said, I feel more like a pastor than I've ever felt in my life. And I thought that was quite wonderful, actually, because he wasn't doing anything for them, but they were doing something for him. Which ended up being the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't mean he's not a good preacher, doesn't do well in the pulpit, but it's entering into a world has community to it. And it put shivers down my back, actually.
Wow.
I think I can give him a stack of books to read first. There's some great books on being a pastor, but they're all a couple hundred years old. Can I tell you my favorite pastor book?
Yes, I'd love to hear it. In fact, I was going to ask if you'd share some of those with us so that we could kind of include those in the show notes so people could take a peek at some of them. Yeah, that'd be great. Let's hear.
Written by George Bernanos, a Frenchman. And I picked this book up, Diary of a Country Priest, when I was taking a trip someplace, and it was an airplane, and I read this, and it was it's a Roman Catholic setting, and this young man became a pastor in a very difficult parish, and he was just so committed to doing this, and his superiors were making fun of him because he was not good looking and was kind of clumsy, and but he was just stubborn to please God. So I read that book, and it was early in my pastoral work, and I thought, I'm going to be a country priest. Diary of a Country Priest. And he kept a diary this whole time. And then he died at quite a young age of some disease, cancer, I think. And so I came home, having done that, and then I read it again, and I read it again. And then at some point I realized it wasn't true. It was fiction. But by that time I'd internalized a lot of it, so
Right.
it became real for me and not fiction. So, but there are a few books like that I keep and reread, and of course, along with the Bible.
So how would you advise a pastor who is under pressures such as growing the church, right, but struggles with finding time to practice the Sabbath or practice self-care?
Take a long vacation. Alexander White was a Scots Presbyterian, and one of his young students came to him. He was a pastor at one of the churches in Scotland for a long time. I don't think he ever changed churches. And one of his young seminarians came to him one day, and he said, "Dr. White, what do you do to be a really good pastor?" And he said, "Relieve yourself as often as possible and take a long vacation."
Wow.
But that, there's a humor there, but there's a truth in it too.
Right.
That you're not doing something that's spectacular. You're kind of content to be in the ordinary.
Right.
I think one of the key things in my own life was my wife and I went to, I can't think of his name right now, but anyway, he was a Quaker pastor, and he urged us to take one day as a Sabbath. So when we came, it was a 3-day retreat, and we came back and we decided we'd take a Monday Sabbath. Jan and I did. And we agreed that we would start it out. We were in Maryland at the time, and there are wonderful trails and rivers and streams, and so there was no lack of place to go and be quiet. And we would read a psalm, drive to this whatever our destination was, and read a psalm, and then agree to not speak until lunchtime. So we did that. We did that for years and years and years. And Jan would pray before we started out after our psalm, and we were fascinated with birds and animals, and carried 3 or 4 books with us that helped us identify them. And then when it was time for lunch, we'd find a tree, a fallen tree, or a big rock, and eat our sandwiches, and then we'd talk the rest of the day as we went back home. But sometimes Jen would say, "I don't want to talk anymore. I've got too much going on here." Oh. And we did that for a long, long time until our children were grown, and then we still take long walks. We aren't always as quiet as we used to be.
What a beautiful, the spiritual practice, and that goes again into the idea of that rhythm.
Well, and it's not easy to do, because the culture defines you in terms of your activity, how many souls you bring to God. You've got to, I think you have to, that's why it's important, for me anyway, to have some mentors in the cemeteries, people who did it right before there were crowds of people to become important in. So yeah, I think we all have a lot to learn, but we don't have to learn it from books or from other people, but we can just pay attention to the birds of the air and the fish of the sea, and learn to appreciate what's going on in this marvelous creation we have. So anyway, we're together on this, I think.
Yes, definitely. There's something to be said about the idea of presence, right?
Mm-hmm.
Just
right.
being present, and whether it's on a long walk, as you're looking at God's creation and allowing God to speak into your life, or whether it's just being present as a pastor with someone who's going through a difficult time. I think that goes back to what we were saying earlier about not always having to have the answer, but just that idea of presence and what that means. It's beautiful, beautiful, brother. I thank you so much for taking time out of your afternoon to spend with me today. It's been a blessing to hear your heart, and just to be able to spend a little time and gain a little from your wisdom. And I definitely believe that our listeners will enjoy this conversation that we've been able to have, and will enjoy the sermons that you shared through your new book, As Kingfishers Catch Fire. So thank you for letting us have a look into your 29 years of pastoring there at that congregation, and how you're speaking into their lives as God was speaking into your life. Certainly appreciate that.
Thank you for your generosity.
And thank you to our listeners for joining us on today's episode. We certainly hope you enjoyed the podcast. And if you are indeed finding value from the Church Leaders podcast, we'd appreciate you taking just a few moments to jump over onto iTunes and to leave us a review. Your positive reviews and ratings help other church leaders find our podcast so they can benefit as well. We thank you so much in advance. And until next time, this is Jason Day, encouraging you to love well and lead well.
You've been listening to the Church Leaders Podcast. For articles, videos, and free resources that will help you lead better every day, visit our website, ChurchLeaders.com. Thanks for listening.